But yesterday we spent a good deal of the first session looking at the difference between transitive and intransitive verbs, transitive and intransitive verbs. And for the most part, if you look at the meaning of transitive verbs, they describe some action or some activity, and to use a transitive verb in a sentence correctly in Somalia, you have to indicate who or what performed that action, but you can't also in the same sentence say, you know, who or what received or the effect or felt the effects of that action. So an equivalent in English would be, I was eating when John came in. Similarly, in Somalia, you can use a verb like yok, in that same sense, yokwe, when John came in, what will since John? I don't know if that will. This will, yeah, right. This will or this will. Since John, I was eating when John came in, but I can't. But with transitive verbs, with the intransitive verbs, then you simply indicate. I may have made a mistake earlier. So with the intransitive verbs, you can only say who performed the action, but you don't. The verbs don't tell you what the action affected, although it may be pretty clearly understood. On the other hand, with transitive verbs, you indicate both who performed the action and what was affected by the action. So a verb like goop, you can't just, if you use goop, you have to say not only who did the gooping, but you have to also indicate whether it was smack or pinay or panache or whatever. Although it is quite possible simply to say gooby, which would translate as I ate it, but you wouldn't normally use a sentence like gooby just out of the blue. You couldn't say I'm a he to gooby. If you do that, it's like saying, good morning, I ate it. And you know, the person you talk to thinks, you know, what's it? You know, what did he eat? You know, or maybe thinks back to, you know, what were we talking about yesterday? Yeah. So I'm not saying you can't say gooby. What I'm saying is that sentences with transitive verbs like goop, as in gooby, are not to be understood in isolation, but only where you've been talking about eating, and that absence of a pronoun there actually is meaningful. The reason why, and also the as I say, the distinction between transitive and intransitive verbs really is the key to understanding the syntax, the key to understanding the rules for putting words together in sentences. We had in English, we saw that the normal order of constituents in English sentences is subject, verb, object. So that if you have a sentence like John ate the meat, it will be subject, verb, and then the meat is the object or the direct object it's called, or you could call it the transitive object, which I'll introduce right now. That the order in sentences is S, V, O. And similarly, if you simply use eat as an intransitive verb, John ate, not John ate it, but simply John ate. and translating these in so that this is the subject. In fact, you can call it the intransitive subject, and this is the transitive subject, and this is the transitive object. Okay, now I want to try to, let's take another look at this, because I want to talk about a major distinction in languages of the world in basic types of syntax. English is one of those languages that exemplifies a kind of syntax that is called nominative. I'll give these big words and try to explain them. A nominative accusative kind of syntax. If any of you have studied Latin or even school grammar in English or in German, you may have learned these terms, nominative case and accusative case. But basically what it is in a language, if the transitive subject and the intransitive subject, and the intransitive subject are treated in the same way and are treated differently from the transitive object. Just copy this down, and I'll be repeating it over again for you and showing again how Semitic is different. If there is really a notion of subject, if the transitive subject is treated the same, the subject of a transitive verb is treated the same way as the subject of an intransitive verb, and that's why I've drawn the line around these two notions, transitive subject and intransitive subject, and they are different from the transitive object, then you say the language is nominative accusative. Most, but not all, but most of the languages of the world work that way. And in English, the transitive subject and the intransitive subject normally come before the verb, and the transitive object comes after the verb. If you learn a language like Russian, and you wanted to say, John ate the meat, or John saw the woman, you would again, to just translate, I won't give it to you in Russian, but you would say something like, John, nominative case, ate the meat, accusative case. There are special marks that tell you what's the subject and what's the verb, and in fact in Russian you can switch the words around because the suffixes will tell you. Similarly in Russian, if you want to say John ate, you just put John or Ivan into the nominative case, and that's it. But if you want to say Mary saw John, it would then be Mary, Maria uvidela, or Maria videla, and just instead of saying John in the nominative case, you have to say John in the accusative case, Ivana. Ana videla Ivana, she saw John, where Ivan, which is the Russian word for John, when it's the subject of a sentence, will occur just like this. But when John gets affected by the action, when it's the transitive object or the accusative, it becomes Ivana. If you study Latin, you learn a whole set of cases like nominative, accusative, dative, ablative, and so forth there. In English, which doesn't have cases anymore for the most part, you simply put the subject before the verb and the object after. But look at pronouns in English, how they behave. I can say, I ate the meat, or simply I ate. You ate the meat, you ate. He ate the meat, he ate, she ate the meat, she ate, so forth. But notice that in English, at least some of the pronouns have special accusative forms. You can't say, John saw I, but what do we say in English? John saw, instead of John saw I, we say what? John saw me. In other words, in English, some of the pronouns have special accusative forms. I has the me accusative. You, does it have a special accusative? You saw me, I saw you. Nope, it doesn't change. He saw me, I saw him. She saw me, I saw her. We saw you, you saw we. No, you saw us. And again, in English, you know, you can be nin, and it doesn't change. You know, you guys saw us, we saw you guys. There's no special plural there. And how about they? They saw us, but we saw them. Now this is standard English and most non-standard dialects too, but in the English Pidgin and Creoles it's a little bit different. But you see, these are what will be, when you study English grammar in school, these are called the nominative pronouns. These are the accusative pronouns. Sometimes you might be told these are the subject pronouns and these are the object pronouns, but basically it means the same thing. That's what's called a nominative accusative kind of syntax. There's another kind of syntax.
So what if we say the direct object of the end, that we know it's always the accusative case?
If it depends on whether all languages will have direct objects, but what's important is, does that direct object get treated in its own special way, as in English or in a nominative accusative language, or when we come now to Somalia and other languages of the world which are a bit different, which don't have nominative accusative type of grammar or syntax. Languages that are called ergative absolutive, we'll see that they treat these concepts this way, that the transitive subject is treated by itself, but the object and the intransitive subject are treated in the same way. And let me try to illustrate that now. If we say, I saw Mary, I think I'll get my sentences right. Ga'a to marry, where ga'a is the verb. I won't make it any more complicated now, but ga'a to see, the hard Y, ga'a, the hard Y at the end is the part that tells it's me, whereas if I said ga'an or ga'at, it would be you or he. And then to marry is our transitive object. So this is the verb, this is the TS, and this is the TO. You can break the sentence down into three main parts, but in fact, gai is a single word, and tmeri is a phrase, a tightly knit phrase that goes together. It's a singular proper noun. Okay, let me take a verb like, what would saibach be okay, to run away? I ran away. Or ni, I ran away, use that, it's intransitive. Okay, let me put this actually to, run away, to flee, Okay, and it's a verb, I mean to run away or to flee. If I want to say, I ran away, well, let's first say Mary ran away, and then we'll change these sentences around. You'll see how it's going. How will we say Mary ran away? Where Mary is the intransitive subject. Mary. We wouldn't say Mary. That just doesn't sound right because we would be inflecting it like a transitive verb there. But notice that the to marry here is treated exactly the same way as the transitive object. Now, if we say Mary saw me, and I'm going to do this one way. There is another way of saying it, which for many people is a bit better, but this is said actually. Gas, Mary, nii. Gas, Mary, nii. I know there's a better way of saying it, which would be Ga'at nii Mary, or Ga'at nii Tamaria. I'll have, Tamari, right. There's another generally better way, but Mary saw me, and notice that that is verb, transitive subject, intransitive object. How about I ran away? Again, nii, not quis nii. It's not right. But what I'm getting at is in some algach, very consistently as we work through the grammar, we'll see that the transitive object and the intransitive subject are treated the same way. Some of you look a bit mystified. I can understand why, because this is new terminology, a new way of thinking, and you may not be all that familiar with English. But this kind of system, where the transitive subject is treated all by itself, and the direct object and the intransitive subject are treated in the same way, is called an ergative absolutive type system. It's common, but it's not the commonest kind of syntax or grammar in the world. But some algach has it. It's very consistent. Inupiq and Yupik, which are the languages spoken by indigenous people, farther north, people that used to be called Eskimo. Their languages are thoroughly absolutive. ergative absolutive. You read in the papers or hear on the TV about the Republic of Georgia in what used to be the Soviet Union. They have their own language called Georgian. It was the dictator Stalin's first language. Georgian is thoroughly ergative absolutive. And in Australia, where I work, most of the indigenous languages, most of the Aboriginal languages are ergative. You treat the subject of a transitive verb in a special way, often having a special suffix for it, and then the subject of an intransitive verb, or the direct object of a transitive verb, they get put together, and they often don't have any mark at all on them. And that's why they're called absolutive. Now, what I'd like to do now is to move on, and I'm going to be talking about kinds of sentences in Somalic, and I'll be making use of these terms, and I'll be explaining them more and more as we go along to you. There's a certain amount of simplifying that I've done, to keep the sentences simple, simply in order to analyze and to present them. But I assure you that even with the very complex sentences, that they all obey, or they all show what's called the ergative absolutive type of syntax. It's quite different from nominative accusative, and people who are primarily speakers of Somalic, which is an ergative absolutive type language, when they speak English, will often carry patterns over from Somalic into English in the way that they use pronouns. I'm not just talking about the lack of distinguishing he and she, but the way you use pronouns across sentences and across clauses. The older people, particularly, who are primarily Somalic speakers and are second language English speakers, is very different from English. But once you're familiar with the syntax of Somalic, you can see exactly what they're doing. The only thing I've read about that is a paper that appeared about 2 or 3 years ago by Marie-Lucie Tarpon. It's in the Salish conference papers, but it would be very helpful for teachers to have a read of that. And once you learn this grammatical terminology, the paper will be accessible to you, whereas if you just read it cold, it wouldn't be. Okay, well, to move on, pardon?
If you have me at the end of the sentence, yes, Mary, me, is it always an intransitive object?
In that case, that gas, Mary, nei, the nei is the transitive object, because you see, nei is what Mary gad to try, when Mary saw me, I didn't feel it, but, the way the verb describes it, I was the recipient of the action she directed towards me.
So what's the difference if we have Mary at the end of the sentence, that is transitive?
But if you say, gad nei, well, that's a focused sentence. That was more like, it's me that Mary saw. Let me just one moment. Oh, no, ga'at nei, to marry, is one way of saying Mary saw me, as well as gas Mary nei. In both cases, the Mary is the subject and the nei is the object, even though they're in slightly different order. But let me ignore that right now. I'll come back to that later, because that's a point where people differ, where there may be change going on in the language, and where you need a notion of deep structure and surface structure, which is even perhaps a bit more confusing. But coming back to this, when I started writing up my chapter on syntax for the language, I had to consider what kinds of sentences are there, basic kinds of sentences in the language. And looking over a range of thousands of sentences, was able basically to classify them into what I'll call declarative or declarative sentences, interrogative sentences, and directive sentences. Basically, the directive sentences are sentences that we use to tell somebody to do something, or to suggest to somebody that they do something. Gup smayest, eat this meat here, or gup smashtun, is a directive sentence. But there are other ways of telling somebody to eat meat that are not quite so direct. Interrogative sentences, in other words, there are different ways of forming directives, and we'll need to look at those, because there's different ways of being polite or being direct. The second great class of sentences, which are called interrogative after English, which are basically question sentences, but there are different ways of asking questions. And then, by far the largest class, when I looked at the greater number of sentences in the materials that I had written down, the greater number are what are called declarative or declarative sentences. Essentially, they're sentences that tell something about the world or the state of the world. And I want to focus now to move into looking at the structure of declarative sentences. Declarative sentences, and I'll be using fairly simple sentences, but I'll be putting patterns on the board for you, patterns to follow. So these are sentences we use to tell people to do something or to suggest it. These are sentences we use to get information from other people, questions. These are sentences we use to speak about the world. Okay, well, let's try this on now. Basically, when you look at the structure of simple, declarative sentences, they always have a predicate, I'll call the predicate phrase, at the very beginning of the sentence. And they have to have a predicate phrase. This P, capital R, capital E, capital D is just a symbol for predicate. Then let me put these on the board, and I'll begin to explain it to you. I'm sorry to use strange words, but there are no words in everyday English to describe it. But this this you should think of as being like a pattern. You know, when you set out to sew material, normally you have a written pattern or you may have a pattern in your head. This is a pattern that I've found gives an explanation or is a description of how simple declarative sentences are formed. I'm sure you can think of other kinds of sentences later on, or as I'm going along here, that are different. But what I'm saying is we're looking at the simplest kinds of sentences first. To explain this, like these parentheses right here, tell you whether you can choose or not. Now, in other words, this is a pattern that gives you several choices. If I cover all of this up right here, because notice that these three constituents here, see, we're talking about four constituents possible in a simple declarative sentence. If I cover up 2, 3, and 4, there are sentences that just have a single simple predicate. Nothing more. No pronouns, no nouns, just a simple predicate. It can be just a simple verb or one of the, well, it wouldn't be a verb, it'd be one of those weather predicates or time predicates, can occur all by themselves. Let's just ignore the oblique right now. The parentheses mean that whatever occurs inside the parentheses is optional, but it can occur. So ignore this right now. Saying you can have another simple sentence will be a predicate plus an absolutive phrase. And a sentence like get marry is a predicate plus an absolutive phrase there. Or you can have an ergative phrase, but if you have an ergative phrase, it must always have an absolutive phrase. So you can have predicate, ergative, absolutive. So I could say, Gas marry John. Mary saw John, where you have predicate, ergative, absolutive. The obliques we don't have to worry about right now, but oblique phrases generally are things that, you know, like S John, S Mary, you know, to John, or the sentence we had yesterday, Guinness married good at home, or at Salgi, you know, gave her child or provided her child with salmon or with half-smoked salmon. That's an oblique phrase, and we're not going to pay much attention to those right now. But basically then I'm saying this is a pattern right now that says you can have the simplest sentence just has a predicate. The next simplest sentence simply has a predicate plus an absolutive. And then the third kind has a predicate and an ergative, and if it has an ergative, it has to have an absolutive. Maybe that's a better explanation. Let's see. This is a way of formalizing these three kinds of sentences. Sentences that have only a predicate, sentences that have a predicate and an absolutive, sentences that have a predicate, an ergative, and an absolutive. If you want to put it another way, most of the time verbs are predicates. So you can have no, you don't have verbs as a single predicate, but where you have a predicate plus an absolutive, it will often be a verb plus an intransitive subject. Where you have an ergative, it has to be a verb, a transitive verb, and this will be the transitive subject, and this will be the intransitive subject. And notice what I was saying earlier about ergative absolutive languages where the intransitive subject and the transitive object, are treated the same. We'll ignore these oblique phrases right now. Well, what I'd like to do is to look at some sentences that exemplify these three patterns. These three patterns. I know the sentences are very simple, but a typical way in doing science or trying to understand the material world around us from a scientific standpoint is to break it down, and to look at simple phenomena, to look at simple things first and move from simple to complex. Because if you focus on the complex things first, you'll often miss the patterns that are in the simplicity. But single predicate sentences are, true single predicate sentences. The predicate will always be one of those parts of speech, that part of speech we call ambient predicates. So that, for example, you can just say by itself, massage, massage. And how would you translate that into English? Massage. Yeah. Or it's daylight. It's daylight. Can, just daylight by itself, or it's daylight. You could also say slack massage, which would be what? Again, it's daylight, or it's become daylight. It's happening right now. How about yuk massage? It's getting daylight. It's in the process. Those, the slack massage and yuk massage are not simple sentences. They're a bit more complex. But you can, use these ambient predicates like madam or whis, madam or whis, or skech, dark. Simply by themselves, and they are complete sentences. Notice when you translate them into English, I can't just say daylight, dark, rain, winter or wintertime. What do I have to say in English? It's or it is daylight. I have to put in a dummy subject and a verb for them. Okay, now, when you look at sentences, sentences in texts, you do find, sentences where there is no apparent subject, where there's no apparent absolutive, where there is just a bare predicate. You do hear sentences simply like sabach or ke, with nothing there, with nothing following them, and they translate perfectly well as, he ran off, or she ran off, he ran away, or he fled, he escaped. But what I want to suggest here right now, in fact, argue strongly, is these sentences don't occur at the beginning of a discourse, or you don't use them without having been talking already. They are what in English we call sentence fragments. Sentence fragments. Sentence fragments. That in English, for example, if somebody asked you, what did you eat last night? What did you have for dinner last night? You can say moose meat. And moose meat stands as an appropriate simple sentence by itself. But on the other hand, if he was just talking, I couldn't say, good evening, moose meat. Not where I'm calling somebody moose meat, but I can't just say moose meat in isolation of the sentence. But as an answer to the question, what did you have for dinner last night, I don't have to say, I had moose meat for dinner last night. I don't have to repeat the whole sentence. So that...
See that sabach too? The older people describe a person as being dead. That's sabach.
Right, so like pass away. It's a sort of more polite way there. Now, what I want to allude to, I mean, so that forms like these are sentence fragments where you've been talking about somebody already and you ask, you know, well, what did he do or what did she do or where is she? And you simply answer back, sabach, or ke, or you could even, where there's no pronoun, nothing there. There's just a bare predicate or verb. And this leads on, before I go on to giving more examples of the next type of sentence, where there's a big difference between English and good Smalga. In English, quite often, we simply, somebody asks you something, you know, was it good? Did you like it? And it's quite appropriate simply to say yes or no. And but what I want to suggest to you from what I've learned from talking with some older people here, that if somebody asks you, for example, Nes amda, if you simply answer back, it's an English type of answer. The proper answer to something like Nes amda would be simply or is that in answering questions in Smalgic, typically you don't just answer back, you know, with yes or no, but you repeat back, you know, some core part of the question that's been addressed to you. I won't take that a bit further. I won't take that further right now, but I just want to make that point that in answering questions, you always repeat something back, and then again, you know, what it is you repeat back may just be a word like it's a single predicate. But you wouldn't normally at the beginning of a conversation just say Doesn't make sense, you know, what's Okay, well, let's look at some more sentences that consist not simply of a single predicate, but of a predicate plus an absolutive. And here's where we have to start being more precise. VI here stands for an intransitive verb. If your verb is intransitive, you have to ask, well, you know, what kind of noun is the absolutive? What kind of noun is the subject of that intransitive verb? If it's a proper noun, like Bruce or Mary or so forth, Bruce or Mary, then if it's singular, it has to have T to tell you it's singular. If it's a plural proper noun, it has to have dip. So, for example, I could say, Sabach Bruce. Bruce ran away.
Bruce is dead.
Oh.
You don't want that.
Okay, well, marry them. Okay, but notice that if you leave the T or the dip out and just say Sabach Bruce, it's not really a good sentence. It's ungrammatical. That this T right here is not only telling us that it's a singular proper noun, but it's also telling us that it's the intransitive subject is the subject of an intransitive verb, what is called an absolutive. On the other hand, I'll erase this right now. If we have a common noun, and let's just, as an example of a common noun, use the child. Can we say sabach ich? Sabach ich. Okay? You have to have the th in there. In that case, the th attaches to the verb. Sabach ich. Sabach ich. And we'll stick with singulars right now. Won't go into plurals because if it was plural, we'd have to have we'd have to have a plural verb.
Ran away?
Well, ran away or passed away in the old.
Yeah. But if you want to run away, you put soy back.
Okay. The other one would be then. Is it sui or sewi?
Well, Eastern is our sui.
Okay. Doesn't. See, what's important here is simply we're using an intransitive verb.
Yeah.
Using an intransitive verb so that the pattern, you see, for a common noun is its intransitive verb with th after it. Th is what is called a connective. Boaz was the person who developed the term connective. In other words, these are called connectives because they connect the predicate with the intransitive subject. And they also tell you that the intransitive subject is a common noun, not whether it's singular or plural. Are there questions?
Yeah, that's not right. That means a plural.
No, I'm just talking about one kid.
Oh, this one.
Yeah. Sui bach, killed kid. Just one child, or, another child. Right. Okay, another pattern for sentences that have a single predicate, have a predicate plus an intransitive subject would be to take an intransitive verb plus a pronoun, a personal pronoun. And we'll stick with sui here. And a personal pronoun would be something like I ran away. Now, sui bach ni. Sui bach ni. Is that okay by itself? Yeah. If we put a th in, sui bach ni, no good. If we put the t in, sui bach ni, no good. So see, what we're doing right here now is beginning to put the patterns down. If you have an intransitive verb where its subject is a proper noun, then you have to use the t or dip. If we have an intransitive verb where the subject is a common noun, then you have to use the hl connective. If you have a personal pronoun, you don't use any connective and you don't need any proper noun marker, no t or dip. And it's this set of pronouns right here that's worth putting on the board for us right now. Because we could say sui bach ni, sui bach nin, sui bach nit, or sui bach nit. Okay, short in that case. Sui bach nit. The usual way for us, sui bach nu, nu. Okay, now sui bach nism or sui bach nism.
Once you
Oh,
put-
sorry, right. Okay, you have to change. We're complicating, but you have agreement there, right? What I'm trying to concentrate on, the reason why I'm trying to keep it simple is to not change too many things, but second person plural pronoun, and then nidit, nidit. So, for an intransitive verb, where the subject is a personal pronoun, you don't put anything between the verb and the pronoun. The pattern for making a sentence is just intransitive verb followed by a pronoun, personal pronoun. Not any personal pronoun, one of the personal pronouns from this series, and these are what I and others call Series 2 pronouns. Series 2 pronouns. We'll get the Series 1 and the Series 3 another day, not today. And what we just saw right here is, you know, in English, if we say, he is running away, where you have a third person singular subject, the verb has to agree, is running away. But if I say they, can I say they is running away? No, they are running away. Well, similarly, in some algef, we have bach for the singular with ni, nin, nit, and all with the plural nu, nism, and nidit. That's not directly relevant to what we're talking about right now, but it's worth saying. I was certainly going to say that later on. How about, there's another kind of word that often serves as a, subject, demonstrative pronouns. Demonstrative pronouns. And demonstrative pronouns are things like tun and tust. Tun and tust. They translate literally as this and that, but quite often when people are talking and you see somebody run away rather than use nit for them, or if you don't use their name, people will use things like tun or tust. So can I say sui bach tun? Sui bach tun? Sui bach tun. Yeah, this one ran away. Probably the most usual translation would be he ran away or she ran away, where you haven't mentioned the person's name before, but they're there. I'll give you an example of a sentence like that, not today, but another day, where people will use tun and tust like English, he and she, but it's where you're using, you haven't used the person's name for, where the tune reaches out to whoever it is you're talking about and signifies them. Now, do we have to have anything between sui bach and tun? If we say sui bach tun, no. The connective is, pardon? No, you don't. With the demonstrative pronouns, the pattern is simply intransitive verb plus the demonstrative. In truth, this T right here is the same T as in sui bach tmere. It's really the same T. And you can see that where if you make it plural, where you would have sui kol dipun, where you see you have T being replaced by the plural dip. Sui bach tmere, sui kol dip mere. Where the T and dip of tun and dipun are really the singular and plural proper noun markers, but when they occur with tun, with un and ust, they all go together into a single single word. Then,
You can use it as leading us astray to the bad, no, letter.
okay, well, let's write that down. Sui de bahat, or bat.
So,
Okay, I hope you're not talking about me.
no, it just makes sense.
Yeah, okay, but he's leading us away. Now, I'm going to just focus on this sentence right now before we take our break, rather than push on with new material. But I'll tell you that in this case, the verb is really quite complex. There's 4 different elements in there. 4 different elements in there. This BAH is, if we were to pronounce it in isolation, it would be Bach. But, you know, when you get Bach, you back X between vowels, it generally changes to H. But this is not an intransitive verb, it's a transitive verb. It's, you know, he led us astray. He led us astray. Where the de means, it makes the verb into a transitive, like, you know, you can didalk or da'ak, where, you know, to accomplish something, or you can dida'uth, you can leave with somebody there. The de makes it transitive. This is the he part of it right here. And this all right here, again, marks the verb as being transitive. Now, you have to take my word for all this right now, but it's really quite a complex thing. I mean, this is a verb word by itself. This is the stem part. Well, it's the stem plus suffixes. It's quite complex, and really, the sui goes with it too. It's not just debahat, but it's sui debahat, you know, to lead us astray. But this is our ergative then. See, this sentence illustrates the pattern predicate plus ergative, and that nu is the absolutive, the transitive object. I just sort of anticipating, but what I will do Monday, when we go back on to grammar, is to illustrate some other cases of predicate plus absolutive sentences, you know, like without verbs. You could say, what? Hanak, no, hanak to marry. Marry is a woman. Get Bruce. Bruce is a man. I mean, those sound like very simple sentences. Or get Kyle. Kyle is a child. Those are very simple sentences, but those patterns of where you use the T and the dip, where you use the th, and where you don't use anything, are extremely important. If you leave those out, you'll be talking broken Indian, broken Samalga. And it took me some years, you know, to get onto it. And you can't look at sentences, you know, just one sentence. You've got to compare one sentence with a whole bunch. So what I'm doing with you now is the result of, you know, a lot of analytic work to figure out what those patterns are. But once you get onto it and you realize that the language is ergative absolutive, which most of you probably never ever heard those words before, but I hope I've begun to explain it to you. Once you realize that the language is ergative absolutive, and that, you know, what ergative means and absolutive means, then it will clear up. The other thing is that you just absolutely have to know, is the verb transitive or intransitive, in order to, you know, to use the ths and the ts and the s's and the dips correctly. I'll show you, hopefully, probably maybe Wednesday or Thursday next week toward the end, if we get a chance to look at the structure of verbs, where you can actually look at a verb and there'll always, if you look at the, basically if you look at the third person singular form of the verb, you can tell whether it's transitive or not. If there's a vowel before the T, if there's a vowel following the stem, or between the stem and the T, it's transitive. If there ain't no vowel in there, then it's intransitive. Now, these are things that for those of you who are speakers, you already know this. And when you speak, you don't think about these sorts of things. You just automatically put the sentences together grammatically. If we had to stop and think not only about the effect of what we say, but we had to stop and think about how we're going to put a sentence together, we'd have a great deal of trouble talking, which is why, for example, me, when I can listen and understand and understand most of what people say, particularly if they speak slowly. But when I start to speak, I don't have it hardwired, or I don't have the software in there where I can just do it automatically in the way I breathe or in the way I'm speaking English to you right now. I have to stop and think a bit, you know, transitive, intransitive verb. Is it a simple, am I going to use a simple sentence or am I going to use a focused sentence? Because there are different kinds of sentences, and that's why I'm a bit slow. But again, to carry this on a bit further, for those of you who are teaching the language as a second language to young people who don't know it, so you probably don't want to try to teach them all of this, but you give them a range of sentences, you know, sentences say with limch, and you know, limch toots, you know, the bird sang, limch ni, I sang, limch tune, this one sang, and so forth, where they can take the sentences in and begin to unconsciously abstract the patterns. And if you do what's called pattern drill, where you take sentences that are basically of the same structure, you know, intransitive verb plus a common noun, singular common noun, and drill those, under the right circumstances, a child or a young person will pick the pattern up and get it. You don't have to intellectualize it. But for the sort of work I do, and for people involved in preparing teaching materials and so forth, this sort of intellectualizing and analysis is absolutely necessary, I believe. Linguistic geography, cultural and linguistic geography. And I was thinking about this yesterday afterward. Art and I had a few words about it, that if, and what I'm beginning to talk about is the sources of knowledge, where knowledge basically comes from. And I want to suggest something a bit out of the ordinary right here. That what we were doing yesterday is what you might call cultural and linguistic geography. And I've been asked to write up a little description of this course, what we've been doing for the UNBC, so that I understand they're considering offering credit for it. And certainly as I write the thing up, I'll say, well, in a couple of our sessions, we did cultural and linguistic geography, that we looked at who your neighbors are, you know, your tribal neighbors or other indigenous ethnic groups in the region, either bordering immediately on the Gitksan homeland, or your old people were in touch with them. And we realized as we went along yesterday, and Art particularly, that much of the information I was giving is information that basically arises from your own old people It's not something that I discovered for myself. In many ways, the way I often phrase it is, the old people didn't talk to me just because they liked me, but I think that they were laying a trust on me, that they saw or hoped that I'd be a person who someday, might be able to in some way help, and they were going on record, putting that material on record so it could be used either for the land question, or I suspect some of them pretty clearly foresaw that we would have situations like this now where beginning to take control of your own education. And Art and I were talking a bit about this yesterday, and he was talking about his testimony in the case, and I remarked to him, me as a university professor, if I go into the court, I can testify as an expert witness. I may or may not get attacked, but other things being equal, they'll accept what I say. Yet the irony in that, the unfairness, is that basically my information has come from people like Art and his father and your old people there. Whereas when Art and other elders testified, they were not taken seriously. But I want to suggest that what we're doing here is called culture and linguistic geography. And there's a few other names that might be used, and I want to say something about them. If you were to look in technical journals, sometimes there is a discussion, or a field of study is laid out that's called folk geography, which is not the geography that the geographers study, but it's the geography of untrained, of uneducated people. Every people has a folk geography. Another way it sometimes is called is ethno-geography. So if somebody were to write a paper called The Ethno-Geography of the Gitksan People, it would basically be an account of geography, names of peoples and languages as the old people talked about it. And they did talk about it, knew about it, because they were well-traveled, cosmopolitan people interested in the broader world around them. But what I'm suggesting here is to use terms like ethnogeography and folk geography is to implicitly measure your own geography, your own history against the mainstream. And in its own way, it is just as much the folk geography of the Anglo-Canadian elite, including intellectuals, or their ethnogeography. We shouldn't privilege it in that way by calling it cultural and linguistic geography and your own geography and history as being ethno-history or ethnogeography and so forth. So what we started on yesterday was cultural and linguistic geography, and it's aimed at, it focuses on peoples and languages that border on the Gitksan homeland or who are here in the region who are of importance to the old people. And much of the material that I've given is material, as I say, that doesn't arise with me, but with your own old people, where I served as a scribe, or sometimes like a filing secretary, where I did a certain amount of analysis and so forth. Well, yesterday we looked at languages, and I was telling you about the Athabaskan languages that had just this map, but here is a map with a distribution of Athabaskan language groups on it that appeared in Jim Carey's part of the opinion evidence that he and I wrote for the land claim, for the land case. And you can see just how widespread these Athabaskan languages are. There's this great big bunch of them in Alaska, the Yukon, the Northwest Territories, and British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and even Manitoba. Great big, huge area occupied by Athabaskan languages, and the Wet'suwet'en are included in there. then that little outlier down in the Nicola Valley, then again some more around the mouth of the Columbia River, again in southwest Oregon and in northwest California. And then I told you yesterday, Arizona and New Mexico for the Navajo and Apache. But the Apaches actually went right down into to Old Mexico. And out on the Great Plains, there was an outlier of Apaches, people who are called the Kiowa Apache, who were Apache-speaking people who attached themselves to, who lived, they were separate from, but they were very closely associated with the Kiowa Indians, who have a language all their own. But it's an interesting question then to ask, that I'm saying, you know, where did all these Athabascan people come from? And the people who've studied it believe that the original homeland is up here in the north, and that people migrated from here to the south, some down the east of the Rockies and ending up Arizona, New Mexico, so forth. Others going down essentially along the coast range and ending up in southern BC, Washington, Oregon, and California. Whereas for the Tsimshianic languages that we're going to be talking about today, all the evidence indicates that your language and the language family has been here in this region for a very long period of time. No evidence that takes it anywhere else, no hard evidence. Now, again, yesterday I didn't have a good map, but Art brought in a book this morning on the Tlingit, and it has it had some maps in it that are of interest. And on this side of the page is what you might call a tribal map, or an indigenous ethnic group map, or a map of indigenous nations, if you want to call it that. I'd have to say that this map is pretty outdated in terms of anthropology and modern history, and in terms of your own understanding of nations and locations. But in general, it gives a sort of general area, you know, the Carrier people are just to the east, and the Sekani are a bit east and further away in the Tahltan. But again, they're not located accurately here, and there's no recognition that Babine is a separate language. And what's most outdated is that they simply use this term Tsimshian to include the Gitksan and the Niskat, as though there's one Tsimshian nation. And I'm sure that that's galling, that that's upsetting to many of you when you read it in books or you're taught it in class. So this is not my map, but nevertheless, the three different peoples, the Niskat, the coast, the Tsimshian, and the Gitksan, occupy these territories. There's also a map of the Tlingit peoples here and the different tribal divisions amongst the Tlingit. Some of you will know of the Chilkat Tlingit. Mainly you'd know the word Chilkat blanket. Chilkat blanket. What I learned from old people over on the Nass, as well as some people here, the way the old people here called the Chilkat people was, I think it's Tsish, excuse me, Tsishkat. So Chilkat, Tsishkat. In other words, the English was an attempt to try to pronounce the original name, but this is the way the old people called them. Then Ketchikan. So you could talk about the Gitksan for the people of Chilkat. Gitksan, they're referred to as Gitksan, 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 and very important group of Tlingit who were in very close contact with the Niska and the Tsimshian and the old Gitksan people who used to go down the Fishery Bay in the lower Nast to fish, were people who are called the Tongass Tlingit, and they are known as the Gitkans, Gitkans, and many of them knew Niskam or Tsimsanam, Gitkans. Now I'd like to move to languages that are closer to home here, and talk first about the Tsimshan people and languages, Tsimshan, and then from then I'll move to the Niska, and then we'll end up here. But as you know, the people who live down on the coast are called in our way Tsimshan, Tsimshan. They call themselves, they pronounce it a little bit differently, as Tsimshian, 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 or Sian. Sometimes you'll hear it with an E, Tsimshian. And they call the Skeena River Xian. Once more, Xian? Xian. Xian. Xian there. And notice there's no K here. It's not Tim Xian, unless you say it really, really slow. But this Xian is obviously, it's just a different way of pronouncing the way they do here, the name of the river, Skeena River, as Xen or Xan. Some people break it down as Xi Yen, which would be river or stream, and Yen, cloud, you know, river of the mist or river of the clouds. I'm not sure if that's quite correct.
Olive was just telling me why they call it Cien. Somewhere around Gitksan, there's always
Mist.
source
Yeah.
where the river comes from.
Yeah. So river of the mist then
Well,
is,
actually, in the fall, that whole river, whole Skeena River is nothing but fog. You can get above it, and you can see it. Yen. Yen, you see, that's the fog. Yen.
so the name then describes the river. It tells about the river of mist. But so they use that name to describe themselves as people inside the Skeena, where Tim means in, and it would be referring primarily to what in English we call the Skeena estuary, the part where the tide comes up, essentially up to Kitsilas Canyon, Kitsilas, to Kitsilas Canyon. The K in Xian there is, and it's the front X here, is a prefix that in many Tsimshan names, you find it in many place names, so that, for example, the Prince Rupert area, you'll often see it on maps as called something like this, spelled this way in English, but its name in Tsimshanam is this. Geen, geen, geen. And that geen right there is our same word here, geen. Skunk place. Skunk place, or place of the skunk. Now, looking at what I want to do now is the modern communities where people speak one or another of the two Gitksan languages, and we'll move from south to north. And talking about communities that were traditionally associated, where the people are traditionally associated, where people are traditional owners, not associated, that's too weak, where the traditional owners of the area still live in the area. And there's a village called Clem-2 down north of Ocean Falls and Balabella, where there are people who speak the language. That name Clem-2 is not a Gitksan name, Clem-2, but how is it? The Coast Tsimshian call it something like, it's borrowed, I think. Klimdurg, Klimdurg, and they, that Clem-2 comes from this. But the people who live there, the Tsimshian people, are called in English Kitisu, Kitisu, but in their own language they call themselves Gitksan, 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 there. And they had a village, see, they are the people of the Git of a village which is called Gitksan, Gitksan, and it was located on Princess Royal Island near modern Clem-2. Okay, if you go to Clem-2 today, the main language there is not Tsimshanam, but it's Haltsuk, the language we were talking about yesterday. But there are numbers of people there who identify themselves as Gitksan and talk the coast language, and there are William Robinson there talks this other language called Skurs, which is Southern Tsimshian, which is a different language from the coast language, but it's Tsimshan. It's not Kwagyuth or Kwakwala or so that sort of thing.
The that sir means first to them.
Which is that?
That sir means first in their language.
This good, might be, could be. That
must be their first language. That's why it's described.
Okay. Then the next community up would be Hartley Bay. Again, there are people there who talk Tsimshanam, and the Nislos family who talk not only Tsimshanam but Skurs as well. And the name that I know for the people there, they are the Gitksan, and kat is what? Cane. People of the cane.
They originated from here, you know that route?
Yeah?
Just down here, Gary. They migrated down.
I wanted to ask about that. Wasn't there a village by that same name close by here?
It had, yeah.
call it exactly the same?
Mexican app, they call it.
Okay. Se, gun, kai. Okay, so this is the stream. This gun describes a land feature, and kai is cane. Okay. So people of the cane. Okay, then the next community coming north is Gitksan in English. Gitksan in English, and the people there call themselves Gitksan, Gitksan. And you'll notice that a lot of the names of the people there, the chiefs' names, are similar to here, like Tsibasa. Tsibasa is a name that's found down there.
Six, another part.
Six.
You can see it all through the Linguistics, they have that.
Yeah. Then coming further north, the community that is known as Metlakatla, or sometimes called Old Metlakatla, just across from Prince Rupert, was not a main village in the old days, but William Duncan moved the people there from Port Simpson, and its name in Sagash is Machlakasha, Machla, through, or over, not through, but over, and Kasha is supposed to be a channel. Yeah, so Gitksan, again, Kasha is the same as Kasha, a channel. And then people at Port Simpson, which again was not a traditional community, but it's where the Hudson's Bay Company located a post, in the 1830s, after having been on the lower Ness, but Port Simpson. And if we sound its name out slowly, the old name for Port Simpson is Loch Squaw Alamst. Loch Squaw Alamst. On Squaw, meaning small, and it's Gua because the following sound is a back K. Kalamst is their word for rose, the native roses, so it means, small rose bushes, or small rose bush.
No, the actual hips.
The hips.
Yeah.
The hips.
See what happened in their history. Remember I told the famine? They went split in two.
Right. So the bush then is Kangalamst. Right. Okay. And I think they shortened it and simplified considerably now, and many of the younger people don't really know what the old name means. Now, as some of you know, when Duncan took the people off from Port Simpson to Metlakatla, to Metlakatla, and then he had a row, a falling out with the bishop. They then moved up to Alaska, and they took that name with them, so they call it New Metlakatla or C. Metlakatla. Now, to my knowledge, the language is, in none of those places is very strong. Children don't learn it as a first language, and there's relatively few speakers. There's one more Gitksan community I want to mention now, which is the one in English, which is, well, it's written a number of ways, but often something like this. Gitksan Kalem, and I've talked with some people from there. Rebecca Bolton was the lady that I talked with about the old name and so forth, and the information she gave me was this, that the place could be called either Gitksan Kalem or Gitksan Kalewin. Gitksan Kalem, Gitksan Kalewin. Two ways of saying it.
That's where we originated.
People here from there.
Different type of work.
Just the wolves.
The village
Called what?
Gitlach and
Gitlach and Dek. Well, let's write that down. Gitlach an or n? Okay. Gitlach an Dek. No. But the people who've been living there in recent times are the Gitksan Kalem or Gitksan Kalewin. They're yeah, and they speak their original language is Gitksan or Gitksanum. There are people there from a little bit further up the river who are the Gitksan. Gitksan is the word for canyon. Gitksan. So the Gitksan. Now those are the coast Tsimshian, or the Tsimshian people, where they're living today.
How many villages you got, Bruce?
Well, let me come back to that. I think I listed something like 7 villages today. 7 villages today, including Numatlakatla. Pardon?
There's a village that we call them Git and Dudu.
Gitundudun. Again, another village. Well, I have something like modern villages with people living in them now, just 7. But when you go back further to the last century, say 150 or 200 years ago, there were like 9 different tribes that were recognized in the lower Skeena. The Gitkat were always separate, the Gitksan were always separate, the Gitkasha. But in the lower Skeena, there are other names, and if you want, I can put these down, but like the Ginch-Angik, the Gitundo, Gisbachlots, and so forth.
Fly. Geek means fly. Person called fly. Geek.
Okay. I won't put these names down. If I have a chance, I'll write them. But what I'm getting at here is there's a difference between where people are living today, which is often the result of people making choices to amalgamate, to live together in larger villages for one reason or another, or to get closer to the source of trade goods or to employment and so forth. But the important thing is that the estuary of the Skeena River, which in the old days had, you know, a number of different peoples like the Gitksan and the Gitksan, also had other people who about 1800 or after 1800 moved out of the lower, moved their permanent settlements out of the lower Skeena and shifted up to well, originally Fort Simpson, and lived mainly on the coast. But they continued to go back. I mean, they didn't give up their homelands, nothing like that. It's simply that they changed their residence pattern a bit. Anybody have any questions about Gitksan? There's two languages. The main language is the one we call Gitksanam, or Gitksanam, or Gitksanamach, I guess, in western Gitksan. And then there is this other language called Skuchs, which is southern Tsimshian. It was spoken in the extreme south, only at Hartley Bay and at Disju. China Hat, by the way. That old village of Disju in English is called China Hat. China Hat. And then 7 modern villages today, but in the old days, the people in Lower Skeena were divided into a number of tribes. How do you, some of you can help me, you know, the chief, one of the head chiefs in the last century, whose name is spelled like this. How is that pronounced?
Where from?
From down on the coast.
He's one of the big chiefs.
How?
Legier.
Legier. Okay. Well, that name pronounced like this. Legier. 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 And he had trading partnerships up here, and as some of you know, he tried raiding up here in the past. Okay, so those are, I suppose, the Tsimshian nation. A little bit different today from what it was in the past, but own separate language. In fact, 2 languages, and one of those languages dropping out of use there. Okay, now I'd like to, does anybody have any questions about Tsimshian, the peoples and languages?
Question. If you went to any of these villages, would it be able to understand the language?
If you were to go down to these villages, like say Gitksan or Hartley Bay, and talk your language, if you talk to older people who knew just their own language, they wouldn't understand you. You know, they'd catch some words. But many of the older people understand what they call Gyanam, you know, the upriver language here, because they work together in the canneries and so forth. But they actually are bilingual in the same way many of the old people here learned Tsimshian when they went down and worked in the canneries, or in the old days used to intermarry. Other things being equal, very close relationships between the Tsimshian people and the Gitksan people. But we're talking about different people now. Talk about are the people who call themselves, who in English are called Nishka. The Nishka. And when I first started my work, and in older books the word is spelt this way, N-I-S-H-G-A, Nishka, Nishka. And today the Nishka Tribal Council has changed that from about the mid-1970s people have been spelling it this way, N-I-S-G-H-A, and what they're attempting to do there is to spell the way they pronounce it in their own language, their name for themselves, which is Niska, Niska, Niska. From, as we were talking about yesterday, from Naska, which is the old Tlingit word for Nass, meaning people of the Nass River. People of the Nass River. They call themselves, as I say, Niska, but they don't call the Nass River Nass. In fact, they call the river Liesims. Liesims, or Ksiliesims is another way. Ksi, which means river. Ksiliesims, Nass River. And as I indicated to you yesterday, old people here call that river Tchemsom's River. Ksi Tchemsom, because they, of Tchemsom, who is, we get their, the main figure in their oral literature. There's a number of modern Niska communities, and I want to talk about these now. Kincolith, which is at the, it's on the north bank of the Nass River. You can't, well, you used to not be able to drive in there. I don't know if you can now. But where the estuary, the Nass River, estuary is simply the part of the river where the tide comes in and out. And it's right near the mouth of Portland Canal, Kincolith. It's an attempt to write the indigenous name, which is Gitksan. What's your Kolich? Scalp. So it means place of scalps. Place of scalps. Then I'm not sure exactly what Gin means, except that Gin and Gun occur in many place names, and I think it may describe, I'm not sure which is which.
War, they used to put the scalps on the stick when they marched in. See how many people they killed.
But this was not a traditional village, Gingolich, but it was one that the missionary, it was Tomlinson, I think, and before him, that the missionaries, where they gathered people together from the lower Nass and established a village here for Christians, as opposed to what in the old days used to be called heathen. You know that term, heathen? Yeah. The term that the missionaries used, heathen, which we would write this way, heathen, like that. Okay, when you come upriver today, the next village is again on the north bank of the Nass River, which in English is called Greenville, after Mr. Green, or Reverend Green, who was a missionary there. I think he was a Methodist missionary. And the people of Greenville call the village themselves Lachgaltap. Lachgaltap, which means something like old village site, the old village site. They've obviously been there for a very long period of time, Lachgaltap. How about any villages by that name in the Gitksan homeland? Lachgaltap? Lachgaltap?
Galtap, below Kiskagas, the old village is Galtap.
Okay, Galtap, below Kiskagas, or you could call it Lachgaltap. Just
Well, I
Galtap,
guess you could call it Galtap.
if you were going there or there. And I think, don't some of the old people call Morristown by that same name, Lachgaltap? The village at Morristown, which could be a translation of their name. Okay, so it's above Kincolith on the north bank, Then we get to Canyon City. Canyon City, and the people who live there, or the village itself in Niskatam, is called Gitksan. Gitksan. And it takes its name, they are the Git, the people of Winksishk. Ksishk is the way they pronounce the word lizard, and it has to do with the lizards that ran away when the volcano erupted several hundred years ago that gave warning of the eruption. But the same word over here, we generally pronounce it Ksishk with X's, but they have Ksishk there, the Gitwin Ksishk. And then today, the other village that is still occupied today is called Nuayanch, which is on the south bank, or it's on the south side of the Nass River. It's not near the river, it's several kilometers up from it, called Nuayanch. And in it's called C-I-N-S. C-I-N-S. C-New-I-N-S. Leaves coming out. New leaves coming out. A few years ago, up till 20 years or so ago, there was still a village down on the Nass. Well, people go there and camp during the summer and go there to fish. It's called Ianch. Ianch in English, spelled like this. And its native name would be spelled like this. Lach-Ayens. Lach-Ayens. And the people who lived there, and also the name of the village nearby, are the Gitlach-Tamics. 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 Git, people of Lach-An, are, in a village, in an area. Tamics, like a slough, pond, so forth. It must, have as its root word something like tach, lake, but a tamics is smaller than a tach. Okay, those are the modern villages, 4 villages where the Niska people live. But in the old days, they were actually organized a bit differently, and they had a number of different villages, but there were 4 groups of people who considered themselves to be Niska. People who call themselves the Gitksan, Gitksan, and that means people of the teen, people of the fish trap, people of the fish trap. And these are the people who were living on the lower Nass in Kincolith and Greenville, but essentially they're the people of the lower Nass. Then next are the Gitgigeni, the upstream people. The upstream people, and their main old village was called Lachantlo. Lachantlo, which means Antlo is a mountain slide. And these Gitkigeni are the people who live mainly in Greenville now. The people who live in Lachaltap or Lachaltep are the Gitkigeni. The McKay family, Smogada Mahdi Wilukoda, is one of the leading chiefs there. Then the next people, I've mentioned their name, the people who are in Canyon City. the Gitksan, but Canyon City is a modern village built by the Salvation Army. And then the people on further upstream were called the Gitksan, or Wilkes, Gitksan, which means something like people who float with the current. We'd say Ulks. An Ulks would be, is that right? Get an Ulks if we were translating? Yeah. Okay. So it's to drift with the current. People who drift with the current. And those are the people living up, you know, above Iance and so forth. To my knowledge, and I think my knowledge accords with knowledge over here, from my talks with older Nisga'a people 25 or so years ago, and with older Gitksan people, the Nisga'a didn't use that, you know, middle and upper Nass territory. That's Gitksan territory. And of course, as you know, that's where the overlap, where there's disputes about it now. But to my knowledge, there's nothing in the literature that places the Nisga'a up there. Everything in the literature, everything the old people have always said, even their own old people, gives the upper Nass Valley, at the least, to the Gitksan people there. Okay, so does anybody have any questions? Any questions about the Nisga'a people?
We just talked about the right? They used to call them those things. So it sounds like they come from.
Okay, Lu, that's a name I haven't heard. Lu Shifingan for the whole Nisga'a?
We're talking about runaway slaves. That's all we've ever known about. It's not a runaway slave. You were saying about the Tlingits were runaway slaves yesterday.
No, I was saying the Tlingits used to be captured as slaves here, and that's why the old people use that word. See, in the Tlingit language, Tlingit means person. But because they captured them and they were slaves here, they use the word Tlingit for slaves. Yeah.
But then was ha, isn't that ha, slaves?
Yeah.
But then we call this a runaway slave. When I was a kid, I heard that.
Okay, who are the Lu Shifingan? Is that all the Nisga'a? Okay. So that
You start a war if you tell them now.
I know that. I hope that this is censored. I don't want this out. But anyway, the reason why I've gone over this is, again, we're doing, like I say, cultural and linguistic geography. And many of the names you've seen in English, and older people like Mrs. Ryan know the names in Alga, but I suspect many of you younger people don't know all of the names in Somalia. So I thought it would be useful to go over them and to write them down for you and to talk with you. I'll move on now, and we'll start looking at our own communities. Who is to look at the modern Gitksan communities. Where are there Gitksan people living today here, mainly on the Skeena? And let's start downstream as, you know, above the canyon, you know, upstream, just upstream from the Gitksan. And what would be the first modern community where there are Gitksan people living now? Would there be people living at Cedar Vale? Would that be the first? Are there still some people living there? And Cedar Vale, in English, the name is often spelled like this. Means Ganesh, and you know, you'll be told it means foot of the jack pine, but what is the name? Okay, so its true name is Mean Skotnist, which means base or foot of the mountain. And
That's a new one, but they had an older village they called Gitksan.
okay, the older village there, this Mean Skotnist was the one that Tomlinson started it up. Okay. But the people there originally were the Gitlu, or how do you say? Yeah. Gitlu-sek. And notice that that's a hard front K there. Okay, then coming upriver, the next village is right here, right? Where people, yeah, but where people are living now is here. And this village in English is written like this, and it often is pronounced as Kitwanga, but what's its proper name? Okay, Gitwin-gach. Gitwin-gach. And if we break it down, we have Git, people, and then Win-gach, where there are gach, where there are rabbits. People where there are rabbits, and I know there's some discussion as to whether the proper name should perhaps be Gitwin-gach.
That's a problem. Just lately they changed it to back.
Gitwin-gach.
Gach was the first.
Yeah.
It was after that.
The river there.
Okay, now if we take a diversion and go not on up to Gitksan, but go to Kitwancool. Kitwancool, if we go up the Kitwancool River or Kitwanga River, depends on which village you come from as to what you call it. Kitwancool, what's its indigenous name? Okay, people today call the village Git-an-yao. Git-an-yao. Art, do you know what that yao means?
Hi, yeah.
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 Git-an-yao. So it's similar in meaning, but not the same place as Anspachach, you know, which also means hiding place, or Gispayaks. Gispayaks also means hiding. What's this name Kitwancool come from? Right. The name originally Git-an-yao, and then they changed it to this. And if we write it, that name in Smalkish, it's Gitwin-skool. 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 Git, people of, win, where or place, skool. Skool. Now, skool, we all know the word skoo, like skool, you know, something small. But skool obviously has the same root in it. People describe it as narrow place, you know, where it narrows down.
Would that mean,
Yes?
people of declining numbers, or no?
No. No.
They only have number
No, because you need to look at the meaning of this. This is a noun, and it's a description like skatnist or lachamach or so forth. It's good, you know. It's a place noun that describes, you know, like a narrow place, a narrowing, rather than a diminution or, you know, of growing small, diminishing numbers.
Because I heard that they changed the name to Gitksan after the wars because of the declining number of people.
Yeah, they were almost wiped out.
Mm.
So and they renamed it, said it was a small place.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, I have to accept what you say. Then.
But that's
No problem.
kind of cute. My dad from Kirkwood and trying to describe it like the head chief used to look what we call it in Latin. What should go with that? It's about there's a discrepancy there. Yeah, but in Latin.
Okay. So.
We've got to find out with the elders.
Yeah, so we need to get somebody to,
But I've heard what they say is a decrease in number to some.
yeah. So there's two different
Because there used to be a
explanations.
large little strike from
Yeah.
8 Mile all the way down to the.
Yeah.
The story goes that if you just all holler at once, the bird falls down dead.
Right. Right. Okay, and the next village upstream from here, which in English is written, the name is often written this way, or how is it on the reserve is spelt a little bit different, is it this? Something like that? Yeah. But how's that name pronounced properly in Alga? Okay, if I've got it right like this, Gitksan.